Tes, tes. Ladies and gentlemen, as we are about to begin, please be seated. We would like to seek your cooperation completing this agenda. Kindly switch your mobile phone to silent mode. Thank you. The Honorable Dean of School of Strategic and Global Studies, Universitas Indonesia, Mr. Ator Subroto, PhD, and our esteemed guest and speaker for today, Professor Michael Dutton from Goldsmiths University of London, and all respected professor, lecturers, and participants, good afternoon and welcome to public lecture with the theme The Concept of the Political Drawing on Chinese and Western Social Theory. My name is Salma, and I am deeply honored to stand before you as your Master of Ceremony. On this occasion, allow me to present today's agenda as follows. The first will be opening, followed by opening remarks. Then we continue with token of appreciation and group photo. Then we start the public lecture moderated by Mr. Abdurrahim. Continue with question and answer session. Then we conclude this agenda with closing. Without further ado, the next agenda will be opening remarks delivered by Dean of School of Strategic and Global Studies, Universitas Indonesia. To Mr. Ator Subroto, PhD, the floor is yours.
Very good afternoon. It's very cold here because it's very close with the air condition. It's very cold and windy. Strong wind from the air condition. So again, very good afternoon, everybody, especially Professor Michael Dutton and Bu Heni as the head of European Studies program in School of Strategic and Global Studies, and also Pak Moderator, thank you for your time, and also students, colleagues, and lecturers from School of Strategic and Global Studies. We are very happy for today, our communication with Bu Lily, Herr Lily. Then we make communication with Pak JJ and the team to have kind of this event today, a public lecture in the concept of the political drawing on Chinese and Western social theory. I think what a coincidence, I think. Why? Because this is kind of a coincidence, because currently we like to propose a new studies program focusing on Chinese development. We are on the process to propose new program studies here in School of Strategy and Global Studies as the one edition of the program studies in global areas. As today, School of Strategic and Global Studies have Japanese studies, European studies as Bu Heni as the leaders of this program, and also we have Middle East and Islamic studies, and also we have currently we have American studies. Then in the next future, we hope we also have Chinese studies as one of the founding fathers of this incoming Studies program is here, like Pak Moderator. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's our pleasure to host you, Professor Michael Dutton. I think that your competencies about your experience about China and how China relate with ASEAN and also maybe with Australia. I think currently so very dynamic situation in regional like ASEAN and also is Asia. How Australia, Indonesia, China, and other countries in ASEAN respond to renew our, let's call renew our relationship between uh, countries in the region. I think it's become challenging, become more and more challenging. I think. I hope this discussion, your public lecture about the concept of the political drawing on Chinese and Western social theory will make some kind of enlightenment about how this dynamic relationship between us in the future and something in the next future and for our economy, for our politic, for our society will have kind of very good impact. Whatever can be very dynamic in politics, in geopolitical or geo-economic situation because of this relationship, because of the current development, what happened in US, what happened in Europe, for example, and what happened in Middle East, and what happened in political tension in East Asia, for example, and also the current development in Philippines, Southern Sea Chinese. I think will make our maybe next year, next 2 years, next 5 years will more dynamic. So I think with this public lecture, with your public lecture, I think at least will give us better perspective on this relationship between Indonesia, ASEAN, Australia, and China, and wider for the other countries in the globe. Again, for the School of Strategy and Global Studies, we are very happy to have you here to share your perspective. I hope students either coming directly here or maybe with this recording, they can also take the benefit of your lecture. Thank you very much again from myself because today actually is my last day of my term. So I hope everybody will have a good next strong journey, and of course I hope School of Strategic and Global Studies will support this kind of lecture because at least we can make our perspective more multiple perspective side. Thank you very much and enjoying the public lecture. Very good morning. Very good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dean. Now we will proceed to the next agenda, which is token of appreciation. We invite our speaker for today, Professor Michael Dutton, to come forward. And we invite the Dean of SSGS Universitas Indonesia to give the token of appreciation to our speaker. Thank you very much. Now we kindly invite all distinguished guests and participants to come forward for a group photo. Please make your way to the front and our team will assist in arranging the position. Please come forward and we will take a group photo together. Thank you, everyone. Now we will proceed to the next agenda, which is the public lecture, and will be moderated by Mr. Abdurrahim. Without further ado, I would like to invite our moderator for today, Mr. Abdurrahim, to lead the session. To Mr. Abdurrahim, the floor is yours.
Tes. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my honor to be here to moderate the today discussion and today public lecture with Professor Michael Dutton. The title of this public lecture is The Concept of the Political Drawing on Chinese and the Western Social Theory. First of all, I want to introduce our speaker today, Professor Michael Dutton, holding a joint professor of the Faculty of the Literature at the Beijing Capital Normal University, and also the professor in the Goldsmiths University in London. Professor Michael Dutton work circle around his principle on intellectual interest about social theory and his principle about a geographic archive of China. Increasingly, the distinction between the archive and interest, however, has become a blur. And I think it's in the today world, the Professor Michael Dutton work is really, really important when the rise of the right-wing politician in the Western society and try to find the alternative way and or alternative interpretation of the work still on the question. And I think the Professor Michael Dutton work is really good to answer and give alignment of this issue. His earliest major work, Policing and Punishment in China, who published in the 1992, explored the way of various Chinese government discipline on the subject, while his second major work, Street Life, published in 1998, looked at the popular response to the government on discipline. His third book, Policing a Chinese Politic, who published in the 2005, which is win in the 2007 Leppenson Award for the best book on the modern China from American ASEAN Study Association, explored the underlying dynamic of propelling the Mao Revolution with his other book, Beijing Time, co-author with his former student, reflect another sometimes hidden side to life in the Chinese capital. His latest in today's lecture, we will discuss about his latest book, The Book of Politics, China in Theory, who critique area study in the Western framework by suggesting a new perspective on China political theory. It aimed to move beyond a simply adding non-Western theory to existing framework instead of seeking to re-examine the underlying assumption and operation of Western theory. Without further ado, I invite Professor Michael Dutton to the stage. The time is yours. Uh, you're more comfortable here. It's up to you.
Can you? Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay. First of all, I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank the Institute for inviting me. It's an absolute honor to be here, and to be able to speak about the new book, which was published late last year, and you've already said was called "The Book of Politics: China in Theory." Basically, this is a book not so much about China as about a theory of the political. But it is about, it attempts to try and draw out from China certain concepts that can help us reconfigure what is essentially, in my opinion, a Eurocentric notion of the political. If you're coming from political science, you'll probably be slightly puzzled by the approach that I take, as it's a somewhat different perspective to the usual stock and trade approach of the political sciences. First, I'm taking a different approach to the question of the political because it seems to me, if we look at the political today, the tectonic plates of the political are shifting, and shifting quite rapidly. We've witnessed, over the last 30 years, extraordinary changes in the political. There's been the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of Soviet-style Marxism-Leninism, alongside the rise in China of a socialist market economy, which has resulted in China becoming a global economic player of kind of a major significance. Most recently, we've also witnessed the shifting political alignments that have produced and shown the power of populism, which has grown into a form of xenophobia and a form of a kind of rabid jingoism, which threatens to derail the trade-based globalization that had dominated the world for the past 30 years. Perhaps most importantly of all, however, we are now currently under the Damocles sword of an impending global environmental catastrophe that actually poses for us an existential threat for not just for the West, but for the whole of humanity. And has risen and has emerged because of the very industrialization and expansion of the capitalist market system with profit maximization at its core that really, in a sense, now dominates our world. If we're to survive as a species, then it's really fundamental, I think, for us to begin to rethink the theories that underpin modernity and the whole process by which we have industrialized and advanced in this world. And as a corollary of that, I think the categories and the theories that we've used from modernity need to be, as it were, questioned themselves. And this, in turn, it seems to me, requires a re-examination of our approach to the question of the political, because it is mired in those modernist concepts and categories. Now, my book is not a magic bullet. It is not going to solve these problems. Really, in a way, what the book attempts to do is to offer simply a slight tweaking of perspective, a slight shift in perspective, so that we might start to kind of develop a different way forward, a different way of approaching questions of the political that might actually yield certain solutions. The argument I present is built upon two pillars. First, I think we need to reconsider the concept of the political from a more interdisciplinary perspective. Given that even the personal can now be described as political, we need to recognize that the political is inherently interdisciplinary, rather than being disciplinary bound. Such a broadening of the perspective around questions of politics, I would suggest, should be built not on a political science, but on an art of the political. I'll explain that in a minute. Second, what I want to do in this talk is to develop a political theory that really goes beyond the boundaries of the discipline itself, because the boundaries of the political theory as we currently know it are intrinsically Eurocentric. So let me begin by exploring those two ideas and develop kind of notions of the concept of the political further. First of all, let me begin with the argument about an art of the political. My argument is predicated upon an undeniable fact that much of the power that emanates from the political to move people is not based on some sort of Habermasian idea of the force of the better argument, but on the mobilization of people's feelings, their desires, their passions, their hates, their loves, their dissatisfactions, etc. To this end, what we're looking at then is an art rather than a science. And why? Because an art offers us a better insight into the feelings that mobilize people, that can, as it were, touch people. In other words, art begins to operate from the realm of an affective dimension of the political. So while I'm not denying in this work that scientific methods help us observe trends, or that rationality is integral to the developments of things like John Dreisack's notion of deliberative democracy, what I can say is that none of these things are able to touch the actual feelings that power the political. For feelings and emotions rely upon the mobilization of affect. While confined to the realms of culture, art nevertheless offers us a glimpse of that, albeit on a different scale, because art operates on the level of affective relations. I'm just going to grab some water. Number two. Thanks. Okay. As I said, this is because art operates on the actual level of the affective dimension. It actually works at a latent rather than a manifest level. Thanks. And at this level, it moves us beyond the rational and the pragmatic. It can, in fact, to use the words of none other than Mao Zedong, touch us to our very souls. Art can mesmerize, art can confound, it can seduce. It has the capacity to mentally throw us to change our subjective perspectives on things, and even to momentarily enchant. This is because art works at an affective level. What do I mean by art working at an affective level? Affect, in my reading, is being treated here as a form of energy that bubbles to the surface as a series of emotions, of feelings, of passions. Whether they're love, hate, or desire, or dissatisfaction, it doesn't matter. Affect is below all of those emotions and bubbles to the surface when it's directed and channeled in certain ways. Art relies on this affective dimension to produce its effects. And so too does the political. And I don't need Donald Trump or the MAGA crowd to point this out to me or to you. You can see it, as it were, by simply looking at your television and looking at the way in which it operates affectively. My interest in this affective dimension of the political, however, is not, as you might imagine, sparked by the recent upsurge around the globe, and in the US in particular, of populism. And we see that populism, as I say, across the globe, whether we're looking at Modi's India or Trump's America. So it's not actually sparked by those. Rather, my interest in the question of affect and art grew out of a sense that it was affective energy that gives protein life to any conceptualization of the political, and therefore affect is absolutely essential to any understanding of a notion of political. To explore that, for the past decade and a half, I've been working on the cusp of art and politics, not in Chinese studies, but in art and politics, which is why I went to Goldsmiths, which is a college of the University of London. For those of you who don't know, University of London has, I think, about 17 colleges, most of which have specialisms. Specialism at Goldsmiths is largely contemporary social theory and art. I went there because I wanted to work around these concepts of affect. So I've been working on the cusp of art and politics for about a decade and a half. And to do that, I've been working alongside a conceptual artist in a practice-based master's program, which was deliberately designed around a series of group projects, practice-based group projects. As I point out to my students, they're all graduate students, MA students, in that program, by working in a group project, this is your very first lesson in politics, because group work forces you to work collectively, while a shared project forces them to address what Jacques Rentier once called the thing in common. The thing in common is something that where the group are passionately involved in knowing about, understanding, and developing. And that's, as it were, these are the two constituent parts of the political. That's why it's the first lesson in politics, because these are the two key preconditions for the emergence of any notion of the political. Collective work toward a common goal. In putting students into small groups built around projects that would collectively inspire them because they decided upon it themselves, meant that they built into the very structure of that program and that module, the form of the course rather than the content was already political. The political was buried in the form of the course itself. For me, this offered an opportunity to work around this idea of affective energy and the idea of the art of the political. And while this might appear somewhat idiosyncratic to a kind of conventional political science person, what I can say is that, first of all, it's a good example of the teaching-research nexus, one level, and possibly more important, it points to the things that lie outside the discipline of politics that are actually constitutive of politics, but the discipline itself cannot address or does not address, or addresses in a way that draws it away from the actual affective dimension itself. It doesn't feel the affect, it simply reports it. More than anything else, I guess it also shows how this book is very much tied to my teaching practice, which highlights a point that the literary theorist Paul Deman made many years ago in The Rhetoric of Romanticism, which is that any book with a cover page is always in part autobiographical. By that, what Deman meant was that the biography really, in a sense, is important because trainings, history, cultural context, social and class backgrounds, not to mention one's passion and interests, all play into the contouring of our understanding of things. It frames what we write because it informs the way we think. So if I can use this notion to authorize my approach, what I'm working on, whether I've been working in the past, we've already mentioned some of the things I've been working on, like policing, penology, and social control in China. In a sense, it was always inspired, in a sense, by social theory as well. So I was interested in a Foucaultian approach, which allowed me to look at policing, penology, and social control. Or if I was looking at cultural studies, that inspired my interest in everydayness and a focus on street life, the focus of my work, even though it's been theoretical, has always been circling around contemporary China and this contemporary social and cultural theory. In other words, China is really the anchorage point, if you like, for my theoretical interests. Having China as an anchorage point for my theoretical interests has meant that sometime in the mid-1990s, when the so-called cultural or linguistic turn in the humanities took place and yielded new approach to non-Western knowledge that took the name post-colonialism, I was very interested and invested in that move. post-colonialism emerging out of, essentially out of literature departments, which from the 70s onwards had more or less converted themselves into semi-philosophy departments because they took up issues of questions of representation, the power to speak, questions of author and author response, or the relationship between author and reader, etc., etc. What ended up happening was these departments ended up being housing this shift toward the post-colonial. So when this shift took place, I possibly more than most people in a politics or a political science department was attuned to what a kind of a post-Saidian critique that was beginning to develop around the idea of decolonization of knowledge. Now, there's nothing original about this. I think many people in various disciplines were involved in similar sorts of projects. And indeed, as I look around the room, I see Stephen Keynes here from Monash, Jakarta, who was similarly involved in the same sort of project, but in the field of architecture. And indeed, we were both involved in the development of the Melbourne Institute of Postcolonial Studies, and in fact, we were both editors of the journal Postcolonial Studies, which eventually became basically the journal of record for postcolonialism. So while my work's been influenced by these new trends from within the humanities and my academic work, while it's been influenced by all of these trends that come out of the humanities, I've always been located in a social science department, and in particular in political science departments. Perhaps it's because of the friction I felt between Chinese culture and its influence upon Chinese politics and the political theory I was interested in that seemed to point to a totally Eurocentric nature of the latter, that I started to question the approach and look for an alternative way of looking at the political. And if you want to, and it's not just political science that actually has this sort of Eurocentric approach. I can point from anything from postmodern thinkers like Giorgio Agamben, who you may or may not know, right through to people like the conservative Leo Strauss, as being evidence of this. Agamben, for instance, starts his most famous book, Homoseka, with Bio and Zoe, which come from the Greeks. Leo Strauss, on the right, basically thinks that Western civilization is the tension between Athens and Greece, and then that's applied to the entire world. And speaking of Leo Strauss, I'm hardly kind of alone in kind of, as it were, bouncing off these sort of tensions to express a certain dissatisfaction. Indeed, there's a story that's told about a very famous Middle Eastern scholar by the name of Martin Burnell, who you may or may not know, who was the author of a very classic book, next slide please, called Black Athena, which really, in a sense, was drawing on the Islamic and Middle Eastern roots of Greek knowledge and Greek philosophy. And the reason Burnell undertook this work, which took decades to produce, the reason he undertook that work was because he was working at Cornell. And Cornell had a very strong Straussian group that thought everything came from Athens. And so what Burnell wanted to show was that these concepts actually have a prehistory. For those of you who don't know Leo Strauss, he's the father of the neocons, and influenced everybody from the political philosopher Harvey Mansfield, who you probably know, right through to the literary critic Harold Bloom, and on to political figures like Donald Rumsfeld or Paul Wolfowitz, who were powerful in George Bush Jr.'s last Republican government before Trump. And I haven't even begun to mention public intellectuals like Francis Fukuyama, who was also a student of Leo Strauss. So Strauss's influence on the conservatives within the United States has been incredibly strong. Perhaps it was because of this sort of disquiet, a disquiet that clearly Burnell felt, that I started to wonder, I started to try to explore the kind of a way of developing a non-Eurocentric form of political theory to overcome the bias that really, in a sense, parades itself as global. Political theory always parades itself as global, yet it's kind of quite provincial. And to demonstrate that, I want to take you to a bookshop, to a thing, next slide please, to a book I discovered at a bookshop. It's translated into Chinese, and that book was in a bookshop next to Tsinghua University in Beijing. Mammoth book, 900 pages long. It had to take 2 volumes in Chinese because it's so big. My eyes were drawn to this book, which is written by a very famous British political theorist, and goes by the very simple title, On Politics. The simplicity of the title, however, belies the fact that the assumptions that underpin this book are anything but modest. It claims to be, as the subtitle says, a history of political thought. And it's a history of political thought that takes us, which one critic has said, and I quote them, is the most ambitious and comprehensive history of political philosophy in nearly a century. So this is no random book. It's actually a significant canonical book within the field of political theory. And it indeed is a mammoth undertaking. It leads the reader, if you read it from the Greeks, the Greek thought of Herodotus, Plato, and Aristotle, through the effects of Christianity on political theory with Augustine and Aquinas, onto the pragmatism of Machiavelli, before turning to Hobbes, Hegel, and Marx, and finally winding back under the category of today. You'll see the present, or Jindian, right? Or Jin, as it says there. And it basically, before going back to that, and what it looks at under the notion of the present are notions of democracy, which of course come from demos in the Greeks, or sovereignty, which of course comes from the Treaty of Westphalia, or imperialism and colonialism, which of course again come from the capitalist West and the expansion, global expansion and exploitation. Slide 8, please. It's a work, I have to admit, of great erudition. I'm not denying that. And a mammoth undertaking. And as such, it's a work that really, in a sense, it's not. I'm not criticizing the work itself, but one has to begin to ask of works like this: whose political theory? Can a work that plots the passage of the political from the ancient Greeks to the contemporary US really be called a history of political thought? Or, more accurately, is it not a history of Western political thought, as it has come to colonize the imagination of the political theorists worldwide? Presented without any of those sorts of regional caveats, isn't this book simply another sign of the power of the West, not simply to colonize the non-West physically, but, as it has done in the past, but perhaps more importantly, to continue to colonize the mind with categories and conceptualizations that have left more than an unconscious mark on the global mapping of the discipline like political science? If we acknowledge that politics is in fact global, everywhere has politics, we have to ask, why do we have political theory that only deals with the West? So if we acknowledge that it's global, and it's manifestly different in every culture, surely then it's incumbent upon us also to ask why all significant theories of the political are essentially derived from the West and carry within them certain assumptions about the ontological and epistemological underpinnings of who we are as social subjects. Once again, I'm far from being the first person to ask these questions. Next slide, please. Jacques Derrida, for instance, raises the point. Next slide. Jacques Derrida, of course, yeah, that's it. Raises the point that all theories of the political and of rights are essentially European, before moving on, next slide please, to asking whether in fact the political is a universal translating machine. If it is indeed a political, if indeed the politics is of the political is a universal translating machine, then one would have to say that the text I've just mentioned that I found in Beijing is part of the technology of the operation of that translation machine. Next slide, please. Edward Said, going back to Edward Said, has also addressed this question of the Western nature of most political theory. He addressed the European categories, but he attacks it in a somewhat different way to Jacques Derrida. In Edward Said's work, he raises the idea of traveling theory. And traveling theory, he suggests, is Western theory that travels to the non-West, but in that process of travel, it operates differently in different contexts, cultures, and disciplines, and is reshaped in the process, taking on new meanings and new directions. And I accept this, what Said says, but I do wonder if all theory travels, and travels in the same way as Said suggests, or whether some categories that do travel still rely on unconscious theoretical anchorage points that remain wedded in that European tradition. To explain what I mean here, I need to turn from the content of the categories that we employ in political science back to the question of form. Underpinning much of what we take to be political thinking is essentially the binary form. The binary form. The binary form of thinking has its roots in Aristotelian substance ontology that was then reinforced by Christian Cartesian thinking. I think, therefore I am. That Descartes. Right, anyway, sorry. So it's reinforced by Cartesian Christian thinking that then reappears in a secular garb in a dyadic formulation such as state and civil society, or sovereignty and authority. It reaches into more contemporary times and into an image form if we look at the next slide. The Man and the Tank, the events of June the 5th, 1989. The power of that image lies not just in the fact that there's a man there in a tank, but the fact that when we see that image in the West, we immediately think state and civil society. We immediately think of, as it were, those sorts of binary understandings of the world. And it's through that grid that we then made sense of Chinese politics. Underpinned by that binary form, this image was able to speak without words, and it's able to do this because of its form. Form is important, not just content. Pairing all this back to a political expression that underpins all of these ideas is the work of Carl Schmitt. Next slide, please. And the idea of friend and enemy. That binary is the key to understanding the concept of the political, according to Carl Schmitt. In Carl Schmitt's classic text, The Concept of the Political, Schmitt argues that this binary distinction is an indispensable component of any conception of the political because, as Schmitt says, and I quote him here, and you can read it in English there and Chinese there if you read Chinese, the specific political division to which all political activities and political motives can be rendered is friends and enemies. Every concrete antagonism becomes that much more political, Schmitt says, the closer it approaches the most extreme point. And the most extreme point, he says, is the friend-enemy grouping. It's that binary form that holds this together. Schmitt's binary understanding of the political became an important starting point for my re-examination of the political. And it became important for my reconceptualization of the concept of the political for two reasons. First of all, it was because I realized that the Schmittian concept of the political was not just my starting point, it was also the starting point for a very famous politician, Chinese, by the name of Mao Zedong. not only underpins Schmidt's notion of the political, it underpins Mao Zedong's notion of the revolutionary politics. And I basically explore this, next slide please, in this book, Chinese Politics, which is the one that won the prize from the American, the Livingston Prize. Entitled Policing in Chinese Politics, A History, this book begins by quoting Mao Zedong from 1925 or 1926, depending on who you believe, Stuart Schramm or the Chinese, from an article that actually appears in Mao Zedong's selected works, not just anywhere. It's the first line of the first page of the first article of the first volume of his selected works. And it reads, 谁是我们的朋友，谁是我们的朋友，谁是我们的敌人，这个问题是革命主要的问题. In other words, who are our friends, who are our enemies? This is the question that's germane to the revolution. Just as Mao Zedong's selected works begins with this sentence, so too did the Chinese Revolution. Indeed, I've argued that the entire Maoist period in China, really in a sense, is kind of more or less a Schmittian laboratory into the political. Why? Because for both Mao Zedong and Schmitt, the political is inextricably tied to the generation of political intensity, i.e. what Schmitt previously called in the previous slide the extreme point, which is the friend-enemy distinction for Schmitt. You can see this in Mao's political practice on the ground. Mao's endless political campaigns were deliberately designed to intensify the masses and saturate the life world with this question of the friend and enemy, while Schmitt's theories were all tied to the idea of political intensity. That Schmitt and Mao's understanding of the political was always based on this question of the political and how to generate intensity, and this in turn tied it not only to the friend-enemy dyad, but also to the question I became interested in, which was about the channeling and harnessing of affective energy flows such that they would manifest as political intensity. In China and in the Mao era, theoretical experimentation in relation to the friend-enemy divide took multiple forms. Mao didn't just get interested in intensity, but he was also interested in how, as it were, it could be mitigated. Mao tried to complicate the binary picture of the political by establishing different levels of intensity. He argued that binary divisions took on multiple forms. He suggested that there was a principal, secondary, and a third order contradiction, and these needed to be dealt with differently and correctly. Hence his article in 1955 about the correct handling of contradictions. Moreover, he inserted into that binary equation of friend and enemy a third element, which he called the 非对抗的矛盾, the non-antagonistic contradiction. This was a contradiction one might have with someone, but it didn't mean they fully fell over into the camp of the enemy, but it meant that neither were their friend. Here then was a space that opened up for persuasion and reconciliation. And in that sense, Mao Zedong's position shares something of a family resemblance, next slide please, to the Belgian theorist Chantal Mouffe. Chantal Mouffe's celebrated critique of the Schmittian binary was aimed at ratcheting down political intensity, once again by inserting something between the friend and the enemy. And for Chantal Mouffe, that was the idea of an agonistic third element. I too want to develop something around a third element, taking the Schmittian binary and turning onto a third element. Albeit my third element is really one that's quite different from both Mao and from Mouffe. Mouffe's agonistic element and Mao's non-antagonistic contradictions I find still useful, and they're useful to the concept of the political, for they help us measure the degree to which political intensity has in fact fallen short of its most extreme and violent point. It enables us to recognize that there are varying degrees of intensity within the political, and built into any concept of the political has to be something not just about political intensity, which is where Schmidt's theory really lies. The problem with Chantal and Mao's position is that really, in a sense, despite the fact that Chantal Mouffe will tell you this is a way to ratchet down the political, all she's doing is actually describing the state of the political at a given time. That allows for the agonistic element to exist. Because if the political is intense, there is no middle ground. One is either or. Once we reach that degree of political intensity, there is no space to allow for the agonistic. Similarly, Mao Zedong's position can only come out when politics has been ratcheted down and become more moderate. So Mouffe's solution to the violent extremism of political intensity is therefore less a solution than a description of the political moment, a moment that is no longer extreme and violent. The third element I want to raise is not an insertion that tries to ratchet down the political. Rather, it asks a different question. It's an insertion into the binary, but it offers a very different face to the one that either Mao or Chantal Mouffe puts forward. It upsets the binary understanding of the political because at a fundamental ontological level, it enables us, in terms of the political, to start to count to 3. Next slide, please. 到声一，一声二，二声三，么么么么么. Okay, you can read it in other words, everything for Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching, he says, everything begins with 3. And I think the political is no exception. In terms of the question of the political, however, Taoism not only furnishes us with the ability to count to 3, but from my perspective, more importantly, it furnishes us with the concept of vital energy, or qi. And that, it seems to me, offers us insights into the form that any third affective element of the political takes. Like the Chinese notion of vital energy, or qi, affective energy that powers the political is not a solid structure. It's not like an institution or even a solidified relationship like friend or enemy. Again, like vital energy or qi, it isn't a form one can see. As any Chinese traditional doctor will tell you, next slide please, vital energy cannot be seen, it cannot be touched, it cannot be heard. But one knows of its presence only through the symptoms it begins to display on the body, through the color, odor, or sensations of hot and cold on the surface of the skin. We know of the arrival of qi. The presence of this vital energy within the body becomes evident, therefore, to the practitioner of the traditional Chinese medicine by its symptoms. Through a series of techniques, be they acupuncture, moxibustion, or herbal remedies, the traditional Chinese doctor can unblock the flow of energy or otherwise influence its flow within the body. Can one not begin to think of the political as being somewhat akin to the needlework of the traditional Chinese doctor? Instead of thinking of the body, think of the body politic. So, if the political is tied to questions of the flow of affective energy, it's not that the multiple devices of politics, for instance, formal institutions, abstract ideas, personal relationships, or even entertainment venues and financial transactions, it's not like these then don't just operate with, as it were, as they say they do, but they also operate at an unconscious level to help the flow, as it were, along the meridians of the politics, to use the language of traditional Chinese medicine. In other words, these institutions are the agglutinations of that energy and help channel and harness the energy and produce it in a particular form. Do these concrete forms not regulate and channel energy? Of course they do, such that the political will take on a particular concrete form. Irrespective of whether these multiple devices of the political drive us toward or away from political intensity is then less important than understanding their centrality to understanding any contemporary notion of the political. How such devices or machinery develop, are augmented, transforming energy into things like desire, etc., or how they manifest, how they manifest functions, namely Parliament appears to be about debating things. It's also about channeling energy and channeling it away from intensities. How these manifest functions work with this latent channeling function becomes important to my understanding of the political. How, where, and why such machinery leak, so that, in other words, other trends start to emerge, is dealt with in the detail of the book. As politics enters into more dangerous and unpredictable times, I would argue that we need to follow the channeling of these currents and undercurrents more carefully, not despite their unpredictability, instability, and incalculability, but because of them. The book I've written, I think, may offer a radical turn away from standard political science, but it does so in an attempt to try and address these sorts of issues. Next slide, please. And for this, I want to turn to Ludwig Wittgenstein to justify my turn away from political science. Wittgenstein points out that some of the greatest achievements in philosophy can only be compared with taking up some books which seem to belong together and putting them in different shelves. Next slide, please. Like the surrealist map, which came out in 1929, like the surrealist map of all that turned the world on its head to add a new perspective on things, Wittgenstein's comments are, in a sense, really helpful here. I have, in effect, attempted to put political theory on a different shelf. I have put it on a shelf alongside a number of books from China and a number of books from the new humanities. I'm not abandoning the friend-enemy distinction in the concept of the political any more than I'm abandoning all forms of Western knowledge. Rather, I am simply registering the parochial nature of what we currently call political theory and the incompleteness of the Schmittian binary formulation of the political, which I believe is incomplete unless we turn to this question of affective energy. What I'm offering then is a notion of the political that is not centered on institutions or focused on what rational choice theory would call the individual rational utility maximizer. Instead, the approach I'm interested in taking is one which deals with energy agglutinations, dissipations, and transformations. Flows in relation, that always flow in relation to this friend-enemy distinction, but not necessarily toward it as intensity. A lot of politics is about how to avoid that intensity. It is therefore, my work is therefore concerned with these agglutinations, dissipations, and transformations of the flow as they take on a particular political form, even when that political form may appear to be anything other than political. An example of that, just to kind of quickly move off script, Norbert Elias, a fairly famous sociologist, once wrote on the quest for enjoyment. And in that book, he talks about sport and how sport comes into being in Britain, organized sport, group sport, comes into being at the very time that parliamentarianism emerges. And what he argues is the use of sport and the regulation of rules around the expression of this energy allows for a ratcheting down of that energy such that it allows for debate to take place. So I could mention other things as well, like the French theorist Roger Kouai talked about the way in which the festival, which was fully intense, becomes the vacation. Or Theodor Adorno talks about the way in which the culture industry comes to dominate our world, and the culture industry itself is profoundly political. Fluid rather than solid, affective rather than rational, and above all, and most importantly, totally promiscuous. Affective energy is not anchored in any set political position, ideology, or creed. Like the Taoist notion of vital energy in traditional Chinese medicine, The flow can be heteropathic or homeopathic because it has no inherent qualities itself. Instead, unlike the Taoist notion of energy, it takes form only in relation to what it relates to or what it does. In other words, it is context and function, not any inherent qualities that lead to an understanding of this energy flow. That is why the flow of affective energy helps us understand how political theory of a fascist, like Carl Schmitt was known as the crown jurist of Nazi Germany, of Hitler. He was Hitler's crown jurist. So that's why I think I can take Carl Schmitt's fascism, Mao Zedong's communism, and the dithering opportunism of Donald Trump and see a family resemblance between all of them, because all of them are using a mode of political calculation that is about the channeling and harnessing and distribution and transformation of affective energy. Through this type of politics, we can see the channeling of affective energy into a form of political intensity. But by working back from that political intensity to less extreme states of being, we can also see the way in which politics is not just, as Schmitt thinks, about political intensity, it's actually about the distribution of energy and how that relates to the friend-enemy distinction. To ask, therefore, about the towardness or awareness of such affective flows in relation to the political is, therefore, to draw back from that distinction that Carl Schmitt once made between friend and enemy. But it does so in a way that allows us to see the political not just in its most extreme form, which is the way Schmitt sees it, but to see aspects of our life that we all too often ascribe as being non-political, as being intrinsically political. It is this approach, I believe, that will help us direct the political towards a future that does not necessarily lead our world into global catastrophe, but it is only the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Sorry, I will. Thank you, Professor, for your presentation, for amazing interpreting about how the world works today. Is really, really important to know and drawing the line between the Western and other society, like Edward Said word. And I think it's really important time when we are facing the rise of populism, as you said, in many, many words, especially in the Western country. Yesterday, they just win the second place in the German, even though their leader is living in China. For sometimes it's really interesting, even though they are living in the other culture, other country, or feeling the other culture, it doesn't mean that the energy flow into them. It's really interesting issue. And uh, first of all, I want to open the question for the any audience in here to ask the Professor Michael Dutton about his presentation. If there is any question from the audience, let me know, and Mr. Jalang will give the mic to the audience. Pak Komara.
Thank you very much, my moderator. Actually, this is kind of courtesy to you, Professor, because nobody asking, nobody. Actually, my background is not political science. I'm sorry. So, listening to your. So, so listening to your talk, I'm grabbing here and there what kind of animal you are talking actually. But let me asking you what probably this is very simple view. Comparing China and I don't know whether can we compare with Western or say America for example, or Indonesia. seems to me that, sorry if I'm wrong, China political system is a kind of establishing unitary state, right? With very, very strong, we call it to some extent in the coffee shop, authoritarian system. A bit trembling on that. But on the other side, I hope I'm wrong, in the sense that if you're comparing again with Western, the way of political discussion in the Western society and contrasting again my vocabulary of Chinese politics very, very, I think I have to asking my colleague Veronica later on. Seems to me authoritarian force at the back and very, very close, sorry to say again, military power. Crackdown, say for example, Tiananmen or Tiananmen a theater. Sorry, at the time I was in US actually, really trembling, looking at. No, again, straight to the point. I'm actually, especially my background is Indonesia, also a kind tug and war between this is very simple. What's that vocabulary in political science? Between decentralization and centralization. make it decentralization and centralization. To make it simple. Although Mr. Trump challenged by California state of government. Again, can you share with us the Western political dialogue among political party or among political constituent, a kind of negotiation, discussion, and persuasion. That's what we call it, the norm of politics, right? Persuasion, and then starting from disagree, becoming agree. That's in kalau di UI itu in Universitas Indonesia I took from Miriam Budiarjo long time ago. Again, can you share with us to what extent the political system or political dialogue, Western dialogue, discussion, persuasion, comparing with authoritarian and cracking down? That's what we are worried with military behind. And now, to some extent, the discussion is in Indonesia right now because our president's military background. Wow, and then everybody says, I hope that's not happening in us. So please share with us or advise us tug and war centralization because everything should be in order, or dynamical negotiations, which is in, I think in decentralization theory, decentralization is the best because, especially for local politics, because the very close to the constituencies know the social preference, comparing with everybody's in the center. Sometimes they don't know about the so-called social preference in the local community. Okay, I think I stop it because that's going to be get lost myself to entertain my inquiry, probably fit in or not. But the name of social theory is uh, interesting to me because if we can negotiate, dialogue, or discuss on that kind of framework, what social, what's the future of social you would like to have? Either, sorry to say, back to 30 years ago between communism, non-communism, socialism, and so on, and then creating Cold War, and everybody lose, actually, lost. Oke, terima kasih untuk teman-teman dari Indonesia. Ini hanya to respect my Londonary colleague. I was in Birmingham a few years ago. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Pak Komora. Maybe Pak Komora will emphasize on the relation or discussion about the Western and Chinese idea, how the development between both countries influence today world. I think. There's one other question. I think. From. Uh, the time is your book.
Thank you. Professor, let me ask you about what do you think, your opinion about what is the difference and similarities between Chinese concept on social and Western perspective on social?
Thank
谢
you.
谢老师哦，谢谢您哦，你讲中文讲得非常好哦。
And for this, Bu Henny.
Thank you, Professor Michael, for such beautiful lecture. So I'm unfortunately a political scientist. Ironic, isn't it? So I know that we have a term such securitization. Yeah, well, it is when we discuss non-traditional security issues or non-traditional security matters with the approach or in the frame of a security framework. So we call it securitization. Having heard your lecture, I think I have impression that your very interesting lecture could be recognized as a politicization. So it means the non-traditional issues of politics or the non-traditional matters of politics, but we see it in a framework of politics. Is it like this? So that's my question, first question. And then the second question is, we know that we have international politics and domestic politics. So I got a feeling that you don't distinguish between the international one and the domestic one. How actually Chinese theory on politics distinguish those two? Because if we see, it is quite different when we are exploring the domestic politics theory and international political theory. For instance, when we are talking about the Indo-Pacific doctrine, for example, we all know that Indo-Pacific doctrine meant to expel Chinese from the Asia Pacific and make a glorification to India. So that's also politics. And also the politics of regionalism. For instance, when we are, so I'm actually not. I'm not a purely political scientist because I start my bachelor degree in humanities and arts. So it's simply like you. Mm, but when we see a country with a political determination, I prefer to see that in the paradigm of constructivism rather than realism or liberalism. So I agree the thought of Theodor Adorno and the French. But then when we are thinking on a framework of constructivism and talking about regionalism, I prefer, maybe you know Barry Busan, Professor Barry Busan? Yeah, I'm very much Busanian. So he's also a constructivist. He's also thinking that a country cannot be secure, or a security of a country depends on the region, the other country beside it, and other countries in other region as well. And also, the fourth level of that analysis says that it's also depend on the great power that interfere in the relation between countries and also the security of the country itself. So I hope you can explain this in the perspective of China's political theory. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the audience for the question for this term. First of all, I want to the professor answer the question that you may be more suitable for you. It's not really one, two, three. It depends on yours. I think the time is yours, professor.
No, no, no. Yes, it is. Okay. First of all, thanks for those questions, and they're kind of interesting questions. I'll deal with them one at a time with each of the speakers. First of all, let me deal with the. If can we excuse me? Can we move back to the slide of the man in the tank, please? I'll deal with 1989 first, and the question of China being authoritarian and summed up, as it were, by this image. Which the man in the tank. Thanks. Okay. I want to pick up this issue because I think this kind of particularly it was usually cut off just to one tank and one man, and it's a freeze frame. There's a video that you'll see, and the video puts it while the image itself speaks volumes in the West because of that attachment to the idea of state and civil society and authoritarianism versus the individual versus the collective, us and them, blah, 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 whatever the binary is, that image still works. The minute you look at the video, the tank is actually trying to maneuver around them, and the person stepping in front of them. The power of that video, the power of that image dissipates. No one looks at the video very much. Why? Because it doesn't speak to that simple binary form. It shows a different and more complex picture. And what I can tell you about 1989, because I was there about a month after 1989, was that the story we get, and I know some of the people who, were arrested or dismissed from posts, etc. And I can tell you now that the image we have in the West about Tiananmen Square, it's not a defense of China, but it's far more complicated. And basically, you can look at Tiananmen Square in 1989 as a complete stuffer. It wasn't meant to happen the way it happened. There was no intention. No one died in Tiananmen Square, for a start. No one. Not a single person. That's never recognized. They died in places like Mushudi and on the other side of the city where the people were coming in. I was actually in Mushudi at the time, like a month later, and talked to the residents because they were friends of mine. And basically, the picture was really complicated. It had to do with choosing, they sent in the Beijing regiments, which had not kind of worked because they were too close to Beijing. They couldn't rely on the police. They brought in troops from Sichuan, which is where Deng Xiaoping comes from, but the Sichuan troops had been located on the border of Vietnam. And they'd been, as it were, kind of involved in kind of sort of a bit of fracas down there. Because, of course, as you know, in 1979, they'd had a war with Vietnam, and relations, even in 1989, weren't very good. Those troops come up to Beijing, and when they fire warning shots, which they did, they first fired them into the air. This is in Mushudin. They were ordered to fire them on the ground. The problem was, on the border of Vietnam, it's dirt. You fire it into the ground, it goes into the ground. In Beijing, you fire it on the ground, it hits concrete, it goes up and kills people. So the killings, in a sense, were not in the way in which they're described. Lights went on in the building, the troops panicked, they started strafing buildings. Buildings that contained high-level Communist Party officials. It wasn't, so it's not as simple as just saying that kind of, 1989 was the communists wanting to massacre their people. Much more complicated than that. That's not to defend it, it's just to say it was a complete screw-up. As for the issue of authoritarianism, if you read American area studies on China these days, particularly in the realm of politics, sociology, or the social sciences, you'll find that usually the way in which they address China these days is by sticking an adjective in front of authoritarianism. So you get different types of authoritarianism. That's where the debate now sits. And why does the debate sit there? It's because of the failure of their previous social science theory, called modernization theory. Modernization theory was basically the theory from the behavioralists at the beginning, as I mentioned to you, when area studies begins in the late 1940s, early 50s, it was basically a Cold War mapping exercise. Area studies was designed to allow the Americans to combat the narrative that was coming out of Soviet Russia. And the narrative that was coming out of the Soviet Union was the reason why places like Indonesia are undeveloped is because of the exploitation of the colonial forces. It was because of imperialism. The Americans didn't want that narrative. The narrative that they used was one that came out of Parsonian extensions of Weber, Max Weber. And it was about how modernization theory is all about how you have, like W.W. Rostow from the 50s wrote what was called something of growth, and that had 5 stages, just like the Marxists, actually. And it was basically the whole point of modernization theory was that there was a lack in Indonesia, that in a sense they lacked that spirit, that capital that had been generated out of the capitalism that dominated the West. So and even in the 80s, when I was teaching Chinese politics, invariably you'd find basic questions in any American textbook which was worded something like this. During the economic reform period, China has had economic reform, but it hasn't had political reform. Why? The assumption was that somehow or other the economic reform was going to produce America in the political realm. That was never, in other words, the stated objective of that question was really, why does it lack the political form that should be coming along with the economic reform? And that completely confounded most of the political theorists because it didn't work on the basis of that theory. Authoritarianism became a dominant trope largely from the 90s or maybe slightly later. And the reason why it became a dominant trope was because of the failure of that modernization theory to actually address the question. Western discourses on China. That was the second issue that was raised. Western discourses on China. I'm afraid we're now in a new Cold War. And I don't think that that's going to change anytime soon. And the reason I don't think it's going to change anytime soon is because, particularly if you look at the United States, you have both Democrats and Republicans for very different reasons objecting to China. The Republicans object to it because the old-style conservatives, not the Trumpians, but the old-style conservatives hated communism. So they're anti-communist. Why the Democrats, even the left on the Democratic Party, are against China? And the reason for that is, again, going back to American history, in the 1960s, America developed a thing called the New Left, which you probably already know about, and I don't need to expand on. The New Left was essentially Marxist-inspired, and it generated a whole series of left-wing assumptions and was largely based upon Marxism. What happens in the period I'm talking about, I mentioned how there was a cultural or a linguistic turn. That cultural or linguistic turn was actually the beginnings of what we call identity politics. Identity politics puts the emphasis on justice and global justice and on those sorts of issues where they see China as being, as it were, a kind of a society of injustice. So we then start to see the way in which even on the left there is no support for places like China. So we have almost a bipartisan kind of, as it were, agreement with the only people liking China are the business people that are going to make money out of it. And they weren't very reliable, as we can see now. When Trump's in, they're all kind of coming, like Apple the other day announced that it's going to spend $50 billion expanding in America now. Why? Because of Trump. So what we're finding then is this shift where a new Cold War is starting to dominate, and we are starting to see the effects of that. It's a very different Cold War to the first Cold War. The first Cold War had Comecon, the economic organization that allowed the integration of all of the planned economies of Eastern Europe with the Soviet Union. So it was quite separate, and basically whatever happened there wasn't radically affected by what's going on in the West. What happened when Nixon goes to China and tries to use the China card against the Soviet Union, it opens up China to, alongside, slightly later than that, it was 1976 onwards, 1979 we get the economic reform, and what happens in economic reform? China becomes the factory of the world. It becomes part of the capitalist system, the global capitalist system. Now what we're finding is that global capitalist system, which was essentially sort of the Clinton era, the Blair era, in Australia it was Keating and Hawke, that is now changing. And Trump is changing it radically, so we're now moving back to nation state. Anything else? I think that's it. I hope I answered your question, sorry.
And the second question from Bufero, the different system of interpretation between China and the Western as the whole. Right. The differences between the system interpretation between China and the Western.
Okay. In terms of the social, right. I'm sorry, I forgot that question. I think it's a very different notion of the social. Much more of a state intervention, much more of a kind of a sense of collectivity, no stress on the individual, and also a very different way of understanding even the production of knowledge. I'll give you an example. As I said, for the past, since 2018, I've been working part-time in Goldsmiths, and I was also working in Tsinghua and then in Shoshida in Beijing. When I was teaching in Tsinghua, I was teaching actually in the art school, and we were teaching along with an artist, and trying to do the same thing I was doing at Goldsmiths. And I remember having a sort of an informal class with our students, and I mentioned to them, look, you know, what we're saying, the teachers are saying, aren't necessarily pearls of wisdom. You can have a debate with us. And they all nodded and said, yes, we can have a debate. And then I said, but are you willing to have a debate? And all of them in a row went, no. Yeah, now that would never happen in a class in Goldsmiths. Yeah, I mean, this is the difference. It's a very different sense and a very different sensibility, I think. Plus the fact that it's, sorry, if I can continue, plus the fact that it's coming out of the Danwei system, out of the work unit system. I mean, it's a long time ago. My generation, I mean, I think the younger Chinese here probably are very, very different. It's not just that China is different, it's also that each generation has a different iteration. So people that are my age are very different from the young generation in China today. And China, they're kind of not necessarily any more Western. No, I mean, they may be influenced by K-pop and J-pop and so forth, but and karaoke was big. It used to be big, but it's a kind of a different sensibility to the older generation, which is starting to now give way. But whether it's giving way in a way that actually means it's closer to the West or further away, I think in a sense it's just different. It still manifests itself in a different fashion.
I want to add something for the Professor Michael. There is one book that I really reading deeply from the David Lampton, Following the Leader. When he also a Chinese scholar, American scholar who studied in China, he really emphasized that the different system that in the Western society, when peace happened, Western society tried to increase the power of the civil, the people, and contain the power of the Leviathan, the government. But in Chinese society, when the peace happened, the people try to make more the government make more stronger. The government need to be more stronger because when this crisis happen, the government, the first one who get responsible to protect the people, not the people. This is the system that really differences. This is also can interpret as the authoritarian system or something because China as a society really emphasize the strong government. So I think it's really interesting. For the third question from Bu Henny, the first question is that is your theory or your idea is kind of a politicization. Politicization is really like when in the international relation of Barry Buzan is securitization when the narrative building the narrative building is around the security issue of the something that they want and about your is about the of politicization about the issue of the narrative. Is this kind of same?
I guess the way I would see it is it's really more of an attempt to try and figure out how we really, first of all, can get overcome the Eurocentrism of political theory. That's one thing. Secondly, it's not to abandon Western theory, but rather to try and figure out, okay, if we think of it in this way and use these examples, like for the ones I've picked at, can we actually think about reconfiguring the way in which we think the political? I don't think it's just about narrative. It's more about how we channel and how we harness, how we transform this energy. So, for instance, in my rendition of the political, a commodity that we desire is no less political than, say, a political statement. Because what the commodity does is it produces a certain quietism. That we desire this object, so we will work toward that. We work within the system to get it, and therefore, in a sense, we produce a certain notion that this is the way to go forward, rather than pushing it out onto the street where you demand this social change. So I think it's really about the way in which this energy force is used in relation to that kind of binary form. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at, that we need to reconfigure the political to not just overcome its Eurocentrism, but then having overcome that, figure out, okay, given that politics is global, what other theories might help us that lie outside of our realm of politics or outside the actual discipline and actually can contribute to that kind of reconfiguration.
It's really interesting the question, and I think it's for the last question. I think for the last question, you put in the Hong Kong demonstration in 2019 in your introduction of the book. I'm really interested about this issue because in today Indonesia, if you see the television in the first 3 days, Indonesia is also big demonstration happen in Indonesia. In the several country, in the European, in the American, is also big demonstration. I want to ask a question. What a lesson can be learned from the Hong Kong protest of 2019 regarding the nature of contemporary political fluidity? As you said, like it's Guangxi the relation because in the global system on the social media, one event will influence other events. What do you think about this issue?
In terms of Hong Kong, I think what the Chinese, rightly or wrongly, claim is that these people were all basically stooges. I think this is kind of absurd. I mean, you can't get over 1 million people onto the street as stooges, otherwise you're saying the whole population is stooges. So I don't agree with the Chinese narrative on that. The reason I've raised the issue of the students in Hong Kong was not to either laud or damn them. It was simply to look at the techniques they were using to try and, as it were, get around how, in other words, energy leaked from that system. So, for instance, in Hong Kong, when they wanted to protest and they were frightened of the CCTV cameras, it was around the time of COVID, they started wearing masks, right? So that, in other words, they're able to disguise their own kind of identities, yes. So what I was interested in was the series of techniques that were deployed in those various, I think I used 3 examples. One was from Tiananmen Square, one was from the Hong Kong example, and the third one was the demonstrations of Falun Gong. And how, in a sense, over time, from the time of Tiananmen Square through to the demonstrations in Hong Kong, how we've developed actually another realm, another dimension of the political, which is cyber, which in a sense hasn't been factored into all of these questions, and how in a sense they were able to use that, and then how the Chinese government, in almost a cat and mouse game, tried to overcome those kind of demonstrations in different ways. Again, in the book, one of the things I point to was the study that was undertaken. Again, it was a very social science study of millions of URLs, actually. And it was a study undertaken in Harvard with a massive team where they were interested in, I think they were interested in looking at the way in which a particular piece of technology, whether it could or not, could be translated into multiple languages, and in particular into character-based languages. So it wasn't about politics. It was about how to use this technology. So what they did was, because they had bags of money and tons of research assistants, they gathered up millions upon millions of Chinese URLs. And then they parked them and carried on the research. Then when they came back to look at whether these Chinese characters could be translated or not, what the research assistant kept coming and telling the professor was, they've disappeared. The URLs aren't there now. And the only way a URL could disappear was if it had been physically taken down. In other words, what they had discovered, again, like most academic discoveries, it was serendipitous. What they had discovered serendipitously was the key to understanding Chinese censorship. And what they found about Chinese censorship, again, was counterintuitive. They weren't censoring just anti-communist things, which you'd imagine. Anything that's anti-communist should get a chop in China because it's an authoritarian regime. No, they weren't doing that. They didn't give a toss about that. There was URLs that had been up there for 5 years which were damning the party secretary in various province or whatever, and it was left there. What was the thing they were censoring? It was the spike. If they saw a spike, whether it was pro-government or anti-government, and that spike they thought had the potential to lead to street activity, then it was banned. Why? Persia Shortway. Harmonious society.
Yeah.
You do not, whether they're pro-communists or anti-communists, they didn't care. They didn't want any disturbances on the street or anything that they couldn't control and might get out of control and lead to disharmony.
It's like a kind of nail and hammer society. If there is something nailed too high, it will be hammered to same level.
That's right.
Yeah, it's
And
really
then
interesting.
you would use something like, the Wumaogang.
Yeah.
The Wumaogang, the 50p, whatever it's called, the 50-cent army to try and distract people, or they would kind of try and push another kind of spike that would lead somewhere else away from all of those things. So the entire strategy was built around keeping harmonious society, not around producing a kind of a communist sort of, or fighting off communist things. Now, of course, that leaves out pornography. That's totally bad.
Okay, it's really interesting because like many demonstrations can learn from the Hong Kong demonstration as the good example of how demonstration work. I think it's really interesting public lecture today. I really learned a lot about China and how the Western idea about China need to do Westernization, especially from Europe approach. Thank you for your time, the professor. I take my time back to the MC.
Okay, thank you very much for our moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our agenda. On behalf of the organizing committee, we would like to extend our sincere gratitude to all distinguished guests, speakers, participants for your valuable time and contribution. Also, we would like to thank you for our speaker for today, Professor Michael Dutton. And special thank you to Mr. Abdul Rahim for expertly moderating this public lecture session. So we hope today's session has been insightful and meaningful. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again at the future event. Have a wonderful day. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.